Can you give me a sense of how many folks we got here, or we think we're going to have? Sorry to make you talk.
That's all right. I just unmuted. So we currently have 22 people, and you can see the list in the chat room if you take a look there.
Okay, terrific. Well, then, welcome to everybody.
23 and counting. Bye-bye.
Okay. So my name is Phil Lee. I'm with the Results Leadership Group. And during this presentation, this workshop, if you would like to ask questions, you are more than welcome to jump in anytime. Either send a chat, and the host, Chantel or Jennifer, will actually take that chat and jump in with your question, or you can raise your hand, use that icon, and they can call on you. But when they do that, you have to make your camera work and unmute yourself so that you can actually speak. Either is fine with me. I'm going to jump right into the presentation, but again, welcome to jump in anytime you have questions, thoughts, etc. So this is about using results-based accountability to reduce racial disparities. I'm going to assume there's a wide variety of familiarity with results-based accountability, so I'm going to do a little bit of an intro and then jump into its application. So here we go. The origins of results-based accountability, and I'll say RBA, is the work of Elizabeth Shore, who went around the country, saw that there were many great programs, initiatives that solved a lot of social problems, but they all had trouble going to scale for a variety of reasons. And she decided that bureaucracy often gets in the way of going to scale with great programs. So she said, if we're serious about taming bureaucracies, our best strategy will be a clear and unrelenting focus on results. That's in common purpose. Mark Friedman worked with Elizabeth Shore. They were in a place called the Center for Study of Social Policy. Mark was a chief financial officer for Maryland state government. He considered the CSSP his halfway house as he left government and went into consulting, and that's where he worked with Elizabeth Shore. And based on her work, he created this results-based accountability framework and popularized it, wrote about it in his book, Trying Hard is Not Good Enough, which he published in 2005, and then 10th anniversary edition 2015. RBA has these following principles that apply to today's conversation. The notion of aligning the whole and the parts, and Mark talks about population accountability versus performance accountability, and I'll get into all of this. Rigor in decision-making, working from ends to means with data and with transparency. And actually, incredibly important in this work and in Mark's work is the idea of keeping it simple. And if you read the book, he'll talk about two sets of 7 questions, one at the population level, one at the performance level. With his agreement, I boiled it down to 5 core questions that work at either level. So 5 core questions, keep it very simple. So what we're going to do today is really approach this from 2 angles. One is this idea of aligning the whole and the parts and ends and means. And the second is the application of systems thinking in that 5 sets of questions, those 5 questions that turn the curve thinking process. So we're going to take both those angles and apply that to this issue of reducing racial disparities. So aligning the whole and the parts. I'll use a quick story to set up Mark's thinking on this. So in Baltimore in 1904, there was a huge fire, so bad that they put out a call to neighboring jurisdictions, had them come in to help put out the fire. But when they got to the fire hydrants, these neighboring jurisdictions discovered that for many of them, their hoses, the coupling on their hoses did not match the couplings on the fire hydrants. And that was a disaster. That led to the standardization across the United States of couplings on fire hydrants and hoses so that the systems could work well together. This problem is pertinent and similar when it comes to the work we're talking about, the Community Indicators Consortium, and anybody who's working with any kind of data, working in communities to drive change. And the problem is we got too many words where we often mean different things with the same words and say different things differently, etc. You could take any 3 or 4 of the words on this screen and put them together. You'll sound like you know what you're doing. I'll start with my measurable, targeted incremental results, and then I'll build from that to my strategic systemic indicators, which will then lead to my core priority outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, we have no idea what we're talking about. We often don't want to say anything because we don't want to look like we don't know what we're talking about. But the point here is simply that this work is too important not to be on the same page and be very clear. So in part to address this idea of aligning the whole and the parts, but also in the interest of sort of introducing RBA and some core concepts and terms, let me lay this out. So a measure of well-being for a population or subpopulation in a geographic area. If we're talking about that, ergo, by the way, the Community Indicators Consortium, we call that an indicator. Examples of rates of low birth weight babies, crime rates, air quality index, unemployment rate for whole populations or subpopulations, as juxtaposed to measures of how well a government program, agency, or a system might be a combination of agencies, is working. And we call that performance measures, and there's three types. How much did we do? How well did we do it? Is anyone better off? Now, that's the distinction between population and performance that Mark talks about in his book. You can take this idea of population accountability, look at subpopulations with indicators, and that's how you begin to gauge racial disparities. And we'll talk more about that. You can do the same thing at the performance level, looking at programs, agencies, and their performance measures, and also talk about racial disparities. Okay, I'm going to focus today more on the population level, and you'll see how that plays out. But just to make this point, if you look at all these measures, this is a job training program, the number of people trained, the percent of trainers who are certified, percent of disparities in trainees enrolled, disparities in trainees with new skill level, disparities in trainees employed at new skill level, disparities in trainees employed for more than 1 year, and the disparities in unemployment rate. The point is here that simply these are all performance measures. That's an indicator. All right, so we'll tease that out with a quote from Mark Funkhauser, who's the publisher of Governing Magazine, former mayor of Kansas City, a big fan of results-based accountability. He said that back when he was a mayor, he had all these programs in Kansas City that by their own measures were doing great, and yet things were getting worse. So think programs versus population. So he needed a way to sort that out. Another way to think about this is from systems thinking, this idea of folks are in a boat and there's a hole in one end and somebody in the other end saying, I'm sure glad I don't have that problem. Well, how could that be, right? Well, in our systems, in the way we fragment our work by necessity in many cases, we can have folks who feel accountable for their unit, right, their part, but don't see the bigger picture and they don't share accountability for something bigger. Indeed, the person rowing doesn't even see the whole system. In their mind, their local part is the whole universe. And the problem when you do that is you can make decisions that are rational for your part, but are irrational for the larger system. And that's where we're going. Okay, so the idea is how do you foster accountability for the whole as well as the parts, which is what RBA really sets up. So we get into this by really taking something Stephen Covey said and others have said, which is people and their managers are working so hard to be sure things are done right, they hardly have time to decide if they are doing the right things, okay? And we're looking at this and saying a decision for the whole is different from a decision for a part, in that we turn this around and we say, first, decide the right things to do for the whole. And once we've decided what we want to do, what are the appropriate parts, then we can decide how to do those things right. And that's at the heart of this idea of distinguishing the whole and the parts, or population, from performance accountability. And we'll apply that to racial disparities in a second. But the idea of ends to means is we work from those ends to the means in our decision making. So where might this apply? If you were thinking right now about population accountability, about the well-being of communities, neighborhoods, cities, states, countries, the world, what might come to mind is the pandemic. And this is actually a great example of asking these two questions and how important it is to work from the ends to the means, from the whole to the part. Because if we can't decide what are the right things to do, right? If we're in debate about that, then it's actually very much secondary whether we're doing those things right. Because first we got to be doing the right things. If you take a sort of a medical analogy, if you ask Tony Fauci for a medical analogy, he may make it this simple. If you go to the doctor, and you've got a virus, it doesn't make sense to take an antibiotic. If you've got a bacterial infection, drinking all the soup you want, chicken soup isn't going to help. So we got to get the diagnosis right to have the right prescription. And that's what we're setting up here, okay? But we can ask the same question if, assuming we are doing the right things, we still want to ask, are we doing those right? And even within that sphere of concern, there are issues. All right, so that's setting up. We're going to go to racial disparities, but just setting up that idea, okay? So how's it look if we just take economic indicators? What's this look like in RBA? So you've got the whole, the well-being economically of the community, the country, however you want to look at it, okay? And we're certainly on a downward trend. So what do we do? What are the right things to do, right? And if for argument's sakes, these are the right things to do, then we want to, those are the parts, and we want to decide how to do them right. And they each have their own separate measures and their own separate strategies. How do we get people to, all the debate right now about how to get people to wear masks, to do social distancing, how are we doing the vaccine, et cetera. Each is their own part, and we look at them separately. And so as we're managing, we measure change on these. You're getting updates every day on how we're doing on each of these. And the concept is these are the parts that collectively they should turn the curve on the economic indicators. Now, obviously, you could put health indicators up there too, and that would be a similar, because they're so interrelated right now, okay? So that's the end. Those are the means. That's the whole. That's the parts. And we got to keep asking ourselves, are we doing the right things first? And then are we doing those things right? Now, we can take this down to the level of performance accountability, clients and customers. I happen to do a lot of work with the National Institutes of Health. And one of the ways in which I'm supporting them is we're applying results-based accountability to improving the diversity of the biomedical research workforce nationally, both at NIH, but also among all of NIH's grantees. As you may know, NIH is about a $40 billion operation annually, and they make grants of close to, I think, $30 billion. So they influence a lot of medical research institutions, colleges, universities, centers, et cetera. So if this was what you were working on, you take any single, maybe just a single institute at NIH or a single research program, and you might say, okay, what percent of our leadership is Black, right? Because we want to diversify our scientific workforce. And so you want to decide, well, what are the right things to do? And based on your analysis, you might say, well, these are the variety of ways that we're going to seek to improve the percent of our leadership that is Black, okay? And that's the parts, and each of those you would implement in your own way, right, with strategies, et cetera. And just like we did at that macro whole population level, we're coming back within a single program or agency and measuring the change. Seeing if collectively we turn the curve there, that's the end, that's the means, that's the whole, that's the parts. Now we're going to segue into this conversation, because I would ask, are we doing the right things in this work? And then more globally with respect to racial disparities, okay? So we're going to ask that question going into the second part of this presentation, which is the idea. So I've set you up with how RBA makes this distinctions, whole and parts, ends and means, and why it's important. Because if you don't start with the whole and start with the ends and ask, are we doing the right things, you can be very fragmented and working very hard, and you're not going to turn that curve on a sustained basis. Or like Mark Funkhauser, you're in Kansas City saying, why aren't things getting better? But I want to go to the next piece of this, which is to the idea of applying systems thinking within the context of this whole turn the curve thinking in RBA, which we'll get into right now. And I want to approach it from the context of culture and the idea that culture is really important, right? It's the way that we are sort of programmed to think, and behaviors that are learned and shared, right? What and how we think, how we behave as a culture. And Peter Drucker famously said at one time, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And the notion here is that you can have the best strategy in the world, but if you don't have a culture that will support what you're trying to do, you're not going to get far. And often leadership is discussed in terms of strategies. And frankly, most leaders understand how to, the basics of how to design a strategy, implement it, etc. Whereas culture is a more elusive lever, right? Because it's anchored in unspoken behaviors, mindsets, and social patterns, right? And the term Peter Senge uses a famous book he wrote called The Fifth Discipline. If some of you are familiar with systems thinking, and the idea of learning organizations, he sort of popularized a lot of that. But mental models are deeply ingrained assumptions, generalizations, or even pictures or images that influence how we understand the world and how we take action, right? And what are some ideas of mental models? Well, many, many years ago, Galileo challenged the mental models of his time around the Earth not being at the center of the universe, and he actually was pretty much treated terribly for doing that. He was challenging both the science and the religion of the time. People used to plan their vacations. I don't want to go too far because I'll go over the edge of the Earth. Some more recent example of mental models, and this is Albert Einstein. There's not the slightest indication that nuclear energy will ever be obtainable. It would mean that the atom would have to be shattered at will. And of course, we did go on and shatter the atom. Warner Brothers, Who the Hell Wants to Hear Actors Talk in 1927. Bill Gates, 640K ought to be enough for anybody. And Decca Records rejecting the Beatles in 1961, saying guitar groups are on the way out and they have no future in show business. So, and of course, the question for all of us is what are similar mental models, right? Implicit beliefs or explicit beliefs in some cases that are at work today that are getting in the way of what we might want to achieve. Why is it so important to surface and challenge our implicit assumptions, those mental models? Well, one is high leverage, right? If we can do that, if we can discover our faulty assumptions, that's going to be a breakthrough. But there's also high risk in ignoring faulty assumptions, all right? So I want to go in a second and talk about this, but let me just pause. I've been gabbing at you folks for, 20 minutes. Let me just pause and ask our hosts, are there any questions or pushback, or so far, are people okay with what I laid out for RBA? Because I'm about to go into this idea of surfacing and challenging assumptions, but I'll make sure people are okay. So are we good to go, Jennifer and Chantel?
To answer it now.
Hi, Phil.
Yeah.
You actually have a question in the Q&A, and you can feel free to read it out.
Are you telling me to read it out?
Yeah.
Can you read it out? Because I can't get to my Q&A.
Okay. Yes, I can. It's just from Wilan Kren, and she just says, "Thank you for focusing on indicators discussion on addressing racial disparities. Sometimes, or often, using results-based accountability leads to blaming the victims and/or justifying claims about certain populations. How can we frame the connections, so the whole and the parts, ends and means, so we are able to dig out the rotten roots of inequitable systems?"
I couldn't have paid you to set me up better than you just did. So thank you for that, because that's exactly where I'm going. So anything else, Jennifer?
That's the only question.
Okay.
But if anyone would like to ask a question live, you can turn your microphone on, and you can yourself, and you can ask a question, or you can type it in the chat or the Q&A. Okay.
So let me take us down this road then. And just back to this question. So what's the risk? Well, just one example of the risk in not surfacing and challenging assumptions. And this is also in many ways the risk of groupthink. So this is from March a year ago. Was in the Washington Post, a very long article, and it talked about people who were beginning to focus on fentanyl approached the Obama administration and said, you're focusing on heroin, you're focusing on synthetics, on opioids, OxyContin, et cetera, but the danger is fentanyl. And they were wired to work on those two other issues, and they didn't heed that warning, right? And so if you look at the trend, of course, it was the prescription painkillers and the heroin, which is where they were focused, did increase, but the real the real explosion was under fentanyl, right? So just an example. Okay. So all significant breakthroughs were breaks with old ways of thinking, right? How do we do this though? How do we surface our implicit assumptions? How do we know what we don't know, right? How do we do that? And Senge again talks about the discipline of working with mental models starts with turning the mirror inward, right? Learning to unearth our internal pictures of the world to bring them to the surface and hold them to rigorous scrutiny. So you'll see where I'm going in a minute if you know results-based accountability at all, because I'm going to talk about these 5 questions as a way to turn the mirror inward, okay? The idea is my intention is to plant seeds of ideas and raise doubts about what we believe. Many of our beliefs are inherited, not opinions we have thought through. If you want to really dive into this right here, read Daniel Canahan's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. If you haven't read it, it will unsettle you greatly because it'll make you realize that so much that you think you know and conclusions you've reached through deep thought, careful thought, is just not true. About 95% of what we believe is based on sort of some association we do and biases we've got and so on. And frankly, not a whole lot of it is based on rigorous analysis. But as Einstein said, the significant problems we face cannot be solved at the same level of thinking we were at when we created them. Okay, so a guy named Chris Argyris, who Peter Senge based a lot of his work on the work of Chris Argyris. And Argyris developed this concept of double loop learning. And you don't have to go deeply into this. It's just a basic idea that we're sort of working within a box when we're problem solving, and we don't necessarily think about the assumptions that are behind it. He calls that single loop learning, right? Improvements within an existing system, and start thinking ahead to racial disparities, okay? Improvement within an existing system that rests on underlying assumptions that are implicit and unchallenged, okay? And double loop learning is expanding the analytical frame to explicitly identify and then challenge underlying assumptions. So I'm going to tell you a quick story to illustrate how this works. I have 4 kids, and one of my 2 sons was a textbook ADHD kid. He's much older now. And we struggled, and it was a real struggle. So much so that my wife eventually convinced me to go with her and him to a psychologist and sit down. And I thought, well, I'm not succeeding here, so maybe the psychologist can help my son. And so we go into the office, and there's his chair and my wife sitting and my son and me. And the psychologist, older guy, very experienced, he starts asking me questions. And I think to myself, this is good because he's getting background to help my son. So that's very good. So he's, there's like 50 or 55 minutes for one of these sessions. So he's talking and asking me questions, and that's great. We're about 20 minutes into it, and he's still asking me questions. I'm saying, wow, this guy is very thorough, very thorough. That's great. And keep going, and he's still talking to me. We're like 45 minutes into it, and he's still talking to me. And the light bulb went off, and I realized my son was not the problem, right? I was the problem. Okay. Because I had my assumptions, right? My implicit beliefs, right? Was that my son needed to change the way he saw stuff. He wasn't getting it. I wasn't getting through it to him. We needed to have him change. And he needed to become more disciplined and accountable. Okay. And what was I doing? So 2 things, right? Which through the help of this psychologist, I realized were not helpful. One was, sort of like the broken windows theory of parenting. If anything's out of line, you got to jump right on it. If the bed's not made, you got to get right on it, because that's how you really help a kid to be self-reliant, accountable, and so on. Well, it turns out with ADHD, at least with my son, but I think this is largely true, these kids are struggling so hard to hold their act together, right? Because their brain literally hasn't developed in certain ways yet, that when I would go and make an issue out of the bed being made, I was just pouring gasoline on the fire, right? And it wasn't helping. And what I needed to learn to do, which was very difficult for me, was to let the little stuff go and really just focus on the big stuff. The other thing I learned, and this is more about my own upbringing, both my parents, great people, but very conflict avoidant. And what I would do, and I had a father who was kind of an introvert, and what I would do after we have a big clash with my son over this or that wasn't going right, is I would withdraw, right? Emotionally just pull back. I leave this poor kid on an island emotionally, right? And I learned that doesn't help at all. So what I learned was, right, do I understand ADHD? And do I know what works? And the answer was no, no, and no. And so turning the mirror inward, I actually changed what I was doing, right? I changed what I was doing. I changed my mental models. He went on to get into Florida State, and after a year, he left Florida State, a rough year, and he went into the military. He actually enlisted as just enlisted, right? And he deployed to Afghanistan, which was very traumatic for my wife and myself. Came back, went to the local community college, transferred to University of Maryland, took sciences, graduates. I get his diploma in the mail, and he's summa cum laude. And he's now in the military medical school training to become a doctor. And I'm convinced that had I kept doing what I was doing, much less chance he would have gotten there. But we supported him every step of the way, and it's amazing. It turns out he was very, very bright. And he actually said, I needed the military. It's a cliche, but I needed the military, Dad, to sort of get my own act together. And thank God he came back in one piece. But the story, what I'm illustrating here is simply this idea of challenging using, in this case, RBA, to challenge our own mental models. Because this is the famous 1971 from Walt Kelly's comic strip called Pogo, which was a wonderful comic strip. Tell you how old I am. And this is just famous. We have met the enemy and he is us. So the idea here with RBA is to use transparency in decision-making to surface and challenge implicit assumptions. You make your own thinking and reasoning more visible to others. And rather than entering into the process with the goal of convincing others, you actually enter into the process with the goal of finding out what you're missing. And similarly, when others are arguing for a proposition, for an action, for a decision, use questions to get at their underlying thinking. And in the work of Peter Senge, they talk about the ladder of inference. And it's simply the notion that, and this is even back to Canahan's work on thinking fast and slow, we have to select every minute the data we focus on. You can't focus on everything. In fact, that's part of being ADHD, is that you have trouble screening out, right? But we all screen out every second. First question is, what did we even select to focus on? What reasoning did we apply to it? What conclusions did we reach? How do those solidify, sometimes fossilize, into a belief system? And therein lie the foundations of the actions, decisions we make, the actions we take. And part of the bad news about this ladder of inference is once we've got a belief system, and this is Canahan's work, he talks about confirmation bias, right? We tend to sort of ignore or discount information that conflicts, causes cognitive dissonance with our belief system. And we sort of embrace and don't give a lot of scrutiny to the notions, the ideas that reinforce, right? Confirmation bias. But this idea of advocacy and inquiry is simply to walk people up this ladder when you're trying to bring a group along to a decision, and then walk others down the ladder when they are. And now we apply this idea of turn the curve thinking from results-based accountability. And lo and behold, it is a ladder of inference, because you start with the data, whether it's indicators, how's the population doing, or performance measures, how are our customers doing, right? And we look at what's our own analysis of why, right? What's our underlying analysis about what's driving that curve? With that analysis, we forecast and say, where are we headed? This is just textbook RBA, right? And we ask, is that okay? And if it's not okay, and we might be headed in a great direction, but not as well as we'd like. The curve might be heading in a positive direction. positive, in this case being something a direction we want it to go, but we would like to see it go there even faster. Okay. So we come back to our analysis, and based our understanding of the story behind that curve, right? We brainstorm who can help and what are our options. We make decisions, we apply those, and we come to see if the curve is turned. And RBA in this framework is dynamic. It's not one and done. It's not a strategic plan that you write up in a glossy report and put on a shelf. It's rather managing on an ongoing basis, always taking in new information, always seeking to turn the curve on an ongoing basis measurably. So in RBA, the 5 questions are: how are we doing? What's the story behind the curve? How are we doing is just the data on a trend line, right? Just like we looked at the cases of COVID-19, right? Cases per day, total cases, trending over time, right? What's the story behind the curve? Who are potential partners? What would work? What are the possible strategies we could take with those partners? And what are we going to do? That's the end. That's the means. Okay? So we want to practice advocacy and inquiry within this framework, right? So I'm going to ask our hosts to monitor hands raised. And what I'm going to ask you all to do right now is simply look at this screen and count the number of Fs, the letter F on the screen. Don't share your answer. Just count the number of letters F. I'm going to ask you in a second or in a minute how many you counted. And this is to make the case about transparency. Take your time, and Jennifer or Chantel, in a second, I'm going to ask people to raise their hands, and you're just going to tell me the count, okay? Take your time, folks. Assume this is a very important set of data. Very important. Really want to get the count right. How many Fs are there on this screen? Take your time.
So Phil, can you hear me? Phil, can you hear me?
Oh, you don't, yeah, don't. I'm going to ask. Ready?
No,
yep.
Can you click on that little hide
yep.
button there so that everybody can see the whole screen? Uh-oh.
Oh, I hit everything.
Oh.
So I better go back to, can you see my screen?
Yeah. Okay. We couldn't read the last line.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I see what it was. Yeah, I get it. Yep. Okay.
And I'll let Jennifer go back to.
Okay, so ready? I'm now going to ask folks, I'm going to ask you raise your hand with that little icon if you counted 10. And Jennifer, just yell out how many.
One person raised their
Great. Hand. How about 11?
Oh. Yep, one person. I guess 2
Great.
people.
Okay, yep. 12.
Three people.
Great. 13.
Nope, no one.
Great. 14.
Yeah, 114.
Okay, 15.
No 15s.
16.
16. Yeah, 116.
Okay, so I got a feeling not everybody participated, or else a lot of people have left. But even using that sample, by the way, there's 16. But even using that sampling in something arguably as simple as counting the number of Fs, right? So you're the leader of an organization or of an initiative, maybe a community initiative, and you're an expert. And you go into a meeting and you've got some junior person who's part of your team or part of the effort, new, maybe not real experienced. And you say, now, given that we've got 11 Fs, that's going to dictate a lot here. It's really important that we know we got 11. And you got this junior person sitting there thinking to themselves, I count 16, but what do I do? And the question is, how do you set a context, create a culture in which that junior person will raise their hand and say, I may be crazy, but I count 16. Okay, so part of where we're going, we talk about this idea of transparency and advocacy and inquiry, is to create an opening for people to challenge your, and we say assumptions, implicit beliefs. They can even be about something that you think is as obvious as data, right? Who says there's that many HIV infected people in this community? Because not everybody reports, right? Who says, right, how many cases we've got of COVID-19? All right. So that's one example just to illustrate sort of this idea of using transparency, the ladder of inference, or in this case, the 5 questions and turn the curve thinking. Let me give you another. We talked about sort of solving problems, right? Partners and options. So I'm going to ask you to take a minute and simply, with 4 straight lines going from end to end, in other words, you got to keep your pencil on the paper once you start, with 4 straight lines, go through all 9 dots. So just put 9 dots on a piece of paper, 4 straight lines that go from end to end. Once you put your pencil down, you can't pick it up. Go through all 9 dots. I've had, over many, many years, 1 or 2 people who've never done it before figure this out, but rarely. Some people have done it and they know the answer, but rarely do I find folks who figured this out. I don't know if you want to, if you've never done this before and you solved it and you want to share it, raise your hand and Jennifer or Chantel Jennifer will call on you. You can tell us how you did it. Any raised hands, Jennifer?
Not yet.
All right, so let me take you all out of your misery. Here we go. Ready? Got it? So what's the insight, right? That we assume that the solution space must be within the 9 dots, right? When in fact it didn't have to be. Ergo, thinking outside the box. What's the break with? You broke with that assumption that that's the solution space, which nobody ever says, oh, I know I got to work within the 9 dots. It's just somewhere in your brain there, right? We don't even know it, right? And sometimes it takes a new person to say, well, why do we got to stay within 9 dots? All right. So surface and challenge implicit assumptions, right? Beliefs, mental models, paradigms, biases, presumptions. Okay. That's what we're doing here. Okay.
Phil, you have some questions. Would you
Great.
like me to read them?
I would love you to read them.
Okay. So April Klein had asked, she was thinking about your introduction, and she said it got her thinking about unintended consequences and drawbacks of well-intentioned policies and programs.
Yep.
So she's interested in how RBA can support better predicting or identifying and avoiding those consequences early on.
Great. I will tell you that the short answer really goes back to, was 2 answers there, really. One goes back to Canahan and the idea of thinking fast and slow, which is to have tremendous humility in designing a solution to a problem, which is often the framing that occurs, because the problem is to turn that curve. And we go in there and, we don't know what we don't know. And so I would commend to you that one way to mitigate 2 things. One is to get as diverse as possible perspectives to the table, because, and I'll get there in a second, actually, we inherently can't see the whole system. It's impossible for any one person to see everything because we can only see from where we sit. And only if we get diverse perspectives do we have the opportunity that someone else might say, but you didn't think about what that's going to do to those organizations, right? Or you didn't think about how that's going to play in the legislature, or you didn't, and so you bring in diverse perspectives. And then the other thing is to recognize that you really do have to always approach RBA recognizing almost inevitably there has to be a check and balances among the measures that you're involved with. So if you're at the organizational level, and the classic is, we want to speed up how we get things done, right? And so we're gonna change the timeline for how we process applications or how we, take people through the program. Well, if you don't hold quality constant, right, then while you're speeding up process, right, or making it cheaper, right, quality is going to drop because you don't have this unbounded resources. You are limited, right? A great example of that is the recession in 2008, where we increased the mortgages that were being sold, right? Really went to town on that. And you talk about racial disparities. I mean, there have been settlements about what Wells Fargo did in terms of really sort of unconscionable what they did in terms of encouraging folks to take on mortgages without nearly the resources or they shouldn't have. And what happened was they sold lots of mortgages, but the quality of the mortgages went down to eventually we had, these AIG derivative things. And finally, the whole bubble popped, right? Because the quality of the mortgages were so bad that once there was a run on the bank, the whole thing caved in, right? So the second answer is be careful. And even when you're working at indicator level, right? Well-being of populations. And we want to, improve the percent of kids who are, graduating from high school. Well, if that's a matter of moving resources from somewhere else, we got to ask ourselves, is that, the hole in the boat kind of thing. So it's not a very precise answer, but those are some of my thoughts on how you mitigate against those kind of unintended consequences.
That's
Other
great.
Questions? Yep.
Yeah, there are. So I'll read the next, I guess I'll read the three in a row.
Okay.
For you. Okay. So Leland had just said that she's really happy that you mentioned implicit assumptions. So how do we use systems thinking to challenge our own sort of mainstream implicit bias about communities of color or people of color when you apply RBA?
I'm going there real concretely in just a few minutes, very concretely. Yep.
And then she also said, so if you were white and the system is built to likely confirm or reinforce your assumptions, so what needs to be done so that you raise your awareness enough to surface your own implicit assumptions, short of blasting, and the existing racist systems?
Right. So, wait, did you say short of? Say that again.
Short of blasting those existing racist systems. So how do you?
How do you raise your awareness short of blasting? In other words,
right.
if you can't wipe them off the face of the earth, then how are you going to? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And then you have and the third one is from Glenda Keith, and she just said that those in power tend to hold the majority culture that can impede strategy. So if you're not in leadership, how do you influence a culture of assumption when you are not in leadership?
Okay, I'm going there I love all those questions, and we're going to go there on all three of them. I'm going to ask you just to bear with me, and we're going there very quickly. Those are great questions. And I'll mention, I'll tell my own story when you ask about if you're white, how do you raise your own awareness? All right, so I'll very specifically reference that in where I'm going. Anything else, Jennifer? Should I keep going?
That's everything for now.
Okay. Great questions. We're going to get to all of that. So I want to put another concept on the table, again, out of the work of Peter Senge, a guy named Bone, actually. He talks about the difference between discussion and dialogue. So as you think about, you're using this framework, these 5 questions to get from what's the curve we're trying to turn, what's our analysis of what's driving it, what are collaborations and partnerships we might avail ourselves of, or maybe existing ones we can do more or different with. What are all our options? Thinking outside the box. Are we really clear on the solution space? Are we inside the 9 dots? And then what are we going to do? That's the 5 questions, right? Sort of processing. There's a time for discussion and a time for dialogue, but they're different. Discussion is to make a decision, right? And I'm here to tell, sell, and persuade. I want us to make a decision. I'm going to persuade you as to what's the right thing to do. Dialogue's different, right? Dialogue is to actually inquire, to learn. And that's where this idea of learning organizations come from. If you get the book, The Fifth Discipline, there's a whole section on dialogue and team learning, and it's really good. And it's this concept of dialogue. Okay. So with discussion, I'm going to justify and defend my assumptions, right? Because I want to be persuasive. With dialogue, I'm actually trying to uncover and examine my assumptions. In dialogue, you suspend your assumptions almost physically, in the sense that you hold them up. You suspend them to be challenged. So as a leader or a participant, you go into the process saying, I'll know this was a good process if I walk out with something I didn't walk in with, because somebody helped me to see something I couldn't see, right? And that if collectively we end up with more, and that's where we're going with this, right? In discussion, it's kind of like a ping pong match, right? Who's right? Which one of these is right, okay? In dialogue, you're actually asking how the pieces combine to create a whole. And the whole idea with dialogue is that individuals gain insight that simply could not be achieved individually, okay? And it's the metaphor, of the elephant, in this case, blindfolded doctors and researchers. And the concept here, as I said earlier, is that you inherently cannot see the whole elephant. That's the whole system. When you talk about unintended consequences, you can't know the whole system by yourself. And you're probably going to describe it, as a snake or a tree or a rope or a wall or a fan or a spear. But only if we listen to each other, right? And go in knowing you can't see the whole system, whatever that is, do we have an opportunity, right, to see it for what it is, or at least more globally than we would have otherwise, thereby both mitigating the chance that we'll do things that do more harm than good, but also increasing the chances that the strategies we develop will actually be the most effective, okay? As Pablo Picasso said, there is one way to look at things until someone shows us how to look at them with different eyes. All right. So dialogue, what do we mean here? It's pretty basic, right? Listen, 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 right? If you've ever done the Myers-Briggs, they define extroverts, of which I claim to be one, with extroverts. An extrovert's definition of listening is waiting to talk. And that's not listening. So how do you discipline yourself to really listen to what's being said, to suspend your own judgment, right? How tempting it is when someone says something, you go, what? Of course, because, they're over there and they're limited with what they see, and you don't listen, right? So suspend your judgment. And also, somebody who says, well, let's get outside those 9 dots. At first you might say, oh, that's stupid, right? And really to explore assumptions, right? To have someone might say something and you might go, wow, what do you mean I'm not supposed to make my son make the bed every morning come hell or high water? What do you mean that's going to be do more harm than good? Talk about unintended consequences, right? And instead of, instant resistance, you're going to explore it, right? You're going to explore it. And then ask. And a clarifying question isn't one that shuts someone down, but it's rather one that says, I'm not getting what you're saying. Help me understand, say more. And sometimes someone will be not that articulate and you can help them. And together they end up sharing something that was, not entirely thought out at the beginning, but ends up being a game changer for the group, right? And starting with questions is definitely key. So that's the idea of dialogue. It's a different approach to using the turn the curve thinking. It's, as someone else said, it's not about attacking someone with RBA, hitting them over the head with it. Look, I've done my 5 questions. I know the answer. It's just the opposite. It's engaging in a relationship. But another piece of this puzzle, which I think speaks to all of this, is this study that MIT did of Google. And Google asked them to look at all the teams. They got, tons of teams at Google. And they said, to help us understand what qualities made for the most effective teams. And MIT, it's a good article in New York Times Magazine. You can Google it. Speaking of Google. But they said 2 things. As long as everyone got a chance to talk, the team did well. But if only one person or a small group spoke at all the time, the collective intelligence declined. That was one, okay? That's really just basically over time, everybody's got equal airtime. The second was that the good teams all had high average social sensitivity. They were skilled at intuiting how others felt based on their tone of voice, their expressions, and other nonverbal clues. And why did this matter? It's a matter of what they called psychological safety. It's a group culture. Right? On these teams, there was a group culture, a shared belief held by members of a team that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking, a sense of confidence that the team will not embarrass, reject, or punish someone for speaking up, a team climate characterized by interpersonal trust and mutual respect in which people are comfortable being themselves. So I want to commend to you as you think about this 5 questions, sort of ends to means, whole to part, getting to decisions, by the way. I mean, Mark Friedman will say it's talk to action, not just talk for talk's sake. I read an article in the Washington Post, an opinion piece about a month ago that said, while blacks are suffering, whites join another book club. Talk to action, right? So let me take all that and now apply it to this idea of racial disparities in the United States, right? Okay, and I want to say, in this first question, are we doing the right things? So racial disparities in the United States, in a city, in a state, in a neighborhood, right, in a county, okay? And this question of, are we doing the right things, right? So now we're going to take this idea. I've set you up here with the whole framework. Going to take these 5 questions, going to start with the whole, whatever that is, again, the whole country, could be the whole world, but the whole country, a state, city, county. We're going to practice advocacy and inquiry. We're going to say, what's the story behind the curve, right? So in addressing racial disparities in the United States, what are the mental models that shape our understanding of the story behind the curve? So now I'll tell you a story. 3 years ago, I began this work quite a while ago. I had the experience of working with the California Endowment over the course of a year when they were working on the health of boys and young men of color, and we were applying RBA with a group of advocates and academics, and they were sort of developing statewide strategy. And I got exposed to a lot of material. It was really quite enlightening. I've worked, with the work I do, I've worked with all kinds of communities, underserved communities in a variety of ways. But about 3 years ago, I approached somebody who's sort of an expert on equity, racial disparities. I said, I'm the president of this company. I'm a white guy. I want my company to do more. I should probably be learning more. And she said, yeah. I said, well, what do you recommend? And she put me in touch with a white guy who coaches white guys who want to do this work. And that put me in touch with another guy whose name is Bay Love. And Bay Love was working with a group called the Racial Equity Institute. As we talked, and I told him about RBA, and he said, well, you ought to come see what I do. We do these workshops called the Phase 1 approach, and we're doing one in New Orleans, so come on down. So I went down to New Orleans literally 3 years ago, almost August 3 years ago. And I went through this 2-day workshop, and actually I've uploaded on the materials an article I wrote that was published on the Washington Post webpage in November of 2017, where I started by, in the article I said, how could I have lived this long? I mean, I have my understudies major was American Studies. I got 2 advanced degrees, law and public policy. How could I have lived this long and not known this stuff? And so when one of you asked, how do you raise your own awareness? I want to commend to you this kind of work. I'll tell you another story real quickly because it's really about the same issue. I was asked, I run the NIH Senior Leadership Program, been doing it forever, for years and years and years. Very popular. We get, 100 plus people. We got like 4 classes a year, 28 people. A lot of senior scientist administrators go through it. About 8 years ago, I was told that, by HHS or somebody, or maybe NIH, all the leadership programs have to have diversity sessions on diversity. I was like, please don't make me do diversity 101. Everybody will turn off, So instead, I would just take a health disparity, right? Like death and suffering due to stroke or diabetes or whatever, whites versus blacks. And I'd do it as part of RBA. And I'd say, okay, have you all in groups of 4 or 5 and going to have you just list on a flip chart, back when we could meet in person, list on a flip chart the root causes of disparities in health outcomes in the United States, whatever it was, again, diabetes, let's say, death and suffering. So I did this for 7, 8 years, probably about 900 senior scientists and administrators at NIH, groups of 4 or 5. So that's a lot of samplings. And I can count on 2 hands the number of times over 3 years that when they came back with their flip charts, anybody put the word racism or structural racism on the flip chart. Now, what I would do up until 3 years ago is I would simply say, well, they have something like they'd say, genetics or culture or access to healthcare or access to education. So I would take something out, or food deserts, I'd say, well, let's just take access to education. Why is there a lack of access to education? They go, blah, blah, blah. I say, okay, that's great. Why is that? Blah, blah, blah. Well, why is that? Blah, blah, blah. And finally, somebody say, well, racism. I say, isn't that interesting? I mean, we would have people in these classes that were actually working on health disparities. I mean, there's a whole National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities at NIH. We'd have people from there. We'd have people, all the institutes have programs on health disparities. And we'd have people from those programs. But nobody wanted to say racism. Okay? So after I went through this workshop in New Orleans, I actually brought Bay Love and another person from the Racial Equity Institute, and we implemented a day in this 10-day program. We implemented a day that was just dedicated to the drill of, again, with RBA saying same question at the beginning, but instead of ending there, because I used to end there and say, you all got to work on talking about racism. Now I had a way to talk about racism that was in this groundwater approach. I'll describe it in just a second, but it's very data-driven, data and history. It's not a kumbaya or you should feel guilty or whatever. It's like, we're just going to give you the facts and you can decide what you want, but we're going to give you the real story with data and history, okay? And so now we do a whole day, and it's about, with RBA, where we're going in just a second, which is you got the health disparities, in this case, health disparities, and walk them through an analysis which goes as follows. It's called groundwater because they basically, with data, make this case. You see a fish in a lake that's sick or dead. You worry about what happened with that fish. What's wrong with that fish? How can I help that fish? If it's sick. If you saw a bunch of fish in a lake that were not doing well, you'd say, what's wrong with the lake? If you saw a bunch of lakes with a bunch of fish that were not well, you'd have to start thinking about the groundwater, right? Well, the lakes are our systems: judicial system, educational system, healthcare system, employment system, housing system, right? And the case they make very persuasively is that if you think you're going to clean up the educational system and somehow that's going to be sustainable, if you haven't gotten to the groundwater, the inequity is going to come right back. Going to come right back. And if you think about our history, right? Yes, there's been progress, but there's fundamentally the disparities, and COVID-19 has just made this so stark. The disparities continue. So I'm going to commend to you, and you can go right into the REI website. I've actually taken this very brief paper that Bay Love and Dina Hayes Green, she's the co-founder of the REI, Racial Equity Institute. I've attached it. You should be able to download it from the materials, or if you can't find it, it doesn't work to download it, email me. You've got my email. And I'm happy to send it to you, or go right to the Racial Equity Institute and get a hold of it. So part of this work, when we talk about the story behind the curve, is to actually challenge. And back when I talked about turning the curve on the percent of blacks that were in the leadership in an organization, if you don't include structural racism in what needs to be addressed, you will not sustain a change in the diversity of our leadership. That's a change in mental models. That workshop changed the way I've thought about this ever since. Right? The other resource I want to commend to you is the National Equity Atlas, which is produced by PolicyLink. It comes out of U.S. Equity Research Institute, and they just changed the name to the Equity Research Institute. It's something a little different but they just changed it. PolicyLink sponsors and collaborates on this. Angela Glover Blackwell, who you're going to hear tomorrow, I hope you will join for her presentation. She's the founder of the PolicyLink. And before PolicyLink, she organized a group in Oakland. She left the practice of law because of the disparities she saw in Oakland. And she's actually one of the first people, and this, I'm talking about the 1980s. She saw that census data was too broad to be useful in trying to understand disparities in a community, right? And other data you couldn't get frequently enough. And so she, and this is how long ago it was, she took a map of Oakland and began to disaggregate the data where you'd put transparencies on top of each other, right? Transparencies on top of each other to begin to understand disparities. Well, now, many years later, and she has stepped down, a guy named Michael McAfee is now the CEO and president of PolicyLink, but she's emeritus and continues to do lots of work. And now they have sponsored for a number of years this Equity Research Institute's National Equity Atlas, where you can now go into different 150, I think, largest cities in the country. They're going to move into counties soon, where you can go in and they've got all kinds of measures that you can begin to see the disparities. These are some indexes, and I just picked Georgia as an example of, what they call the inclusion score, the prosperity score, and the racial equity index. They break it down. It's very detailed, and you go in and look at that. And that's another way to, with data, challenge our own mental models. Because as you begin to look across all these communities, and this is part of what they do with the groundwater approach, they show that in every single system, whites always end up ahead of blacks. And those are bookends, by the way. In our culture, people come into the culture and they quickly realize, I'd rather be white than black. So Germans and Irish weren't white at first, but man, did they work to become white, right, et cetera, okay? So within our culture, there's sort of those bookends. But they've showed with data. They also show with data that it's not about SES, right? Socioeconomic status. And they show, for example, that blacks with advanced degrees, black women with advanced degrees have worse maternity outcomes, right, than white women with high school degrees. Right? And they do. So it's an amazing analysis, very powerful. We're going to start having leaders, apart from our senior leadership program, we're going to have some of the leadership at NIH is going to start having presentations made to them of the groundwater approach. So these are ways, when we talk about the story behind the curve, some tools to begin to help folks to surface and challenge their own assumptions about what are the causes of these disparities. Because the alternative, if you don't see it as a system, right, as structural, then your answer is it must be them. It must be their culture. And so this is really challenging those implicit assumptions and having you understand that, no, it's structural and it's great. And the history part is also very, very powerful. That's the story behind the curve. Who are potential partners and what would work to turn the curve? Okay, back to that idea of getting outside the solution space, right? Our assumptions about the solution space. This was in the Washington Post a little over, I guess, a month and a half ago, okay? An opinion piece. Katrina Vanden Heuvel used to be editor of The Nation, I think, and now is a columnist or opinion writer. We are in the midst of a health crisis, an economic crisis, and a social crisis. And systemic racism is at the heart of each. If we are to have any hope of creating real solutions to these three crises, we must dismantle systemic racism by restructuring those systems that allow it to perpetuate. So, restructuring those systems that allow structural racism to perpetuate. What is it we can do, right? So I want to commend to you some additional resources. One is the groundwater approach, right? And this is under the idea of changing the narrative. Because if you're white, like I said in the article I wrote in the Washington Post, lived my whole life right? And if you take that, they do these privilege tests, right? Where you're like on a 1 to 10, they ask you a bunch of questions, and 10 is you're very privileged, and 1 is you're not. I'm like a 10 on every one of those, right? So I'm like the quintessential privileged white male. And I'm telling you, we do a whole lot to not see what's right in front of us. And so the groundwater approach, the equity atlas are all ways to see what we haven't seen that's right in front of us. I also recommend a book by Eduardo Bonilla Silva called Racism Without Racists, because it really lays, and he just published a new edition. It really lays out and helps you to understand how racism morphs. It's an ideology, and it morphs, right? It morphs. And so, it was slavery, and then it's Jim Crow, and then it's, school to prison pipeline, among other things, right? And you have to understand the morphing to understand just how insidious and how difficult it is, and go back to the idea of culture and mental models as an ideology. So it's a really good book on that, and really gets you to I think, help you if you've, first for turn the mirror inward, but also in the extent to which you're advocating, right? Advocacy, as well as inquiry, really help you understand some of the how tough this is and why. So change the narrative. We got to change the narrative. There's if you're familiar with the woman whose name I'm going to forget, but Elliott, Ms. Elliott, who did the brown eyes, blue eyes experiment with kids in elementary school back in the, I think 60s. I think it was 60s. So you just Google Elliott and blue eyes, brown eyes. You'll see it. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And she's still today talking and lecturing. And another example of just surfacing, and she did it with these kids. It's this charming video, which just demonstrated again how insidious this stuff is. So that's changed the narrative. And then 2, identify key public policies and institutional practices that need reform, and develop alliances that have the power to change them. I included in the handouts also a paper called Divided No More by a guy named Palmer Parker. This is like 1993. He wrote it about education. But here's the point, and I cannot overemphasize this. You will not change our institutions if we don't have a movement. Right now at NIH, everybody's talking about structural racism, and it ain't because of me. It's because of what's happening outside of NIH that all of a sudden, and many of you are experiencing this where you're working, all of a sudden everybody's talking about it. Whereas 6 months ago, I couldn't get anybody to say it at NIH. So there's a moment here, but that moment is because it's a movement. And I would just encourage everybody to think in those terms. And a movement is the long term, right? It ain't going to happen tomorrow, right? We're talking at least decades. You don't reverse 300 to 400 years in a year, right? The other thing I want to commend to you is a book called Winners Take All, that probably some of you are very familiar with. And what he writes about is and this may strike a nerve for some of you, but it's the idea that a lot of what we've set up with nonprofits and foundations and the idea that, let sort of the private sector really take on some of these problems is wishful thinking. And in many ways, they are propping up much deeper exploitation that's going on, and that the only answer, and they aren't bad, it's not necessarily bad, except to the extent that if you really, real change is going to come through our policies, right? And through the agency of government. And we have to be involved politically for that to happen. We have to, no option, not just voting. I mean, so those I would just say are really pivotal. If you talk about options, partners, a movement, collaboration, rolling up your sleeves and getting involved politically to really change policy. And then we say, yeah, but, things like reparations, right? So you had a guy named Robert Johnson, who's head of BET, billionaire, and he had this idea that Fox News reported back in June, $14 trillion in slavery reparations to African Americans, right? You got this article in the Harvard Business Review. It's time for U.S. business leaders to talk about reparations. What's going on here? Wall Street Journal, reparations to Black Americans for slavery gain new attention. The House looks to approve for the first time a commission to study compensating for slavery and long-time discrimination. ABC News, Asheville, North Carolina. They adopted reparations as a policy in good old Western North Carolina, the hills of the Smoky Mountains, right? Historic reparations plans. And then all of a sudden, the county that Asheville is in moves to follow Asheville in making reparations. That's Friday, July 31st. And then Saturday, North Carolina reparation efforts focus on generational wealth, avoid direct payments. To the approval of reparations for Black residents in Asheville almost 3 weeks ago is being followed by similar demands in cities across North Carolina. That's 2 days ago. So folks, who knows, right? You'd be right to be skeptical. Is this just going to blow over and be another time that we check the box and talked a lot? Or is there really a window now at this time in our country to really do something meaningful around, our 400-year history? I offer, RBA as a framework that can really serve and be a tool in service of this work. As I summarized, aligning the whole and the parts, rigor in decision making, and keeping it simple. Commend all of that to you. It's the idea of using both indicators and performance measures, but most importantly, the indicators to have that larger conversation about the whole, right? And to see it as dynamic, right? It's dynamic. It's not just one and done. It's we're going to manage this. It's a movement. It's a long-term effort, right? And always checking in, right? To assess our progress and turning the curve on racial disparities and to adapt our strategies as needed. You go back to those 5 questions. Any change in the curve, any new information on the story behind the curve, any new partners, any new options of what would work, any changes to our strategy, right? So it becomes a framework for the movement, right? And really, if you boil it down to its simplest terms, racial disparities are driven by structural racism. And to reduce racial disparities, we have to dismantle structural racism. That's turn the curve thinking. And structural racism is driven by mental models and structures. And we have to change the narrative and change the structures, which is also RBA. And that is it. And I think we got a few minutes. Anybody? Questions, thoughts? Comments, pushbacks? Jennifer? Hello? Hello? Shit.
Hi, Phil. We're still here. It's okay.
I started thinking, oh my God, I've been talking to myself for the last half an hour.
No, I'm just on mute. We don't have any other questions.
Okay.
At this point in time, but we'll give it just a minute or so. If anyone has any other
Yeah,
questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A, or you can also turn your microphone on and ask them out loud.
Yeah. Happy to hear any thoughts, maybe even just reflections. And I've put my email on the slides, and you're more welcome to email me too if there's anything I can share or do to help.
You just have some people telling you that was a great presentation, and thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
On behalf of the CIC as well, if we don't have anyone is not going to say anything else, thank you very much for presenting today. I think that you gave us a lot to think about, and some good resources in order to be able to do that. So
Terrific. Okay, well, my pleasure, and everybody gets to get out 5 minutes early, I think, if we're done. I'll let you make that call, Jennifer.
Yes, I think so. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Go out in the hallway and say hi to everybody. Just kidding.
Can I make a quick announcement there, Jennifer? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes, so just to remind you that the next workshop was canceled. Unfortunately, we still live in a pandemic situation, and that affected the workshop presenters, so they will cancel. So we have actually an hour and a half of open time until the next workshop, so in 90 minutes. So thank you, all of you, for attending this and those who attended the previous workshop, and we'll see you in an hour and a half. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.